is my great honor to introduce José-Marie Griffiths, currently Vice President of Academic Affairs at Bryant University.
I'm delighted to be here and thank Beata for inviting me and for all of you for having me here today. This is an interesting topic. I mean, when people invite me to come and talk about a topic, I like to think of a title that will capture people's imagination. And I've been thinking about the web and where we are on information policy for quite some time, and we're evolving at quite a rapid rate. And a lot of things are happening that I'm going to refer to in my comments. Now I have to put my glasses on so I can see you. So here's an outline of what I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about webs and how spiders spin webs, because I think there are some interesting lessons for us as we think about the web and we think about policy. I do want to talk about the policy process, because I think sometimes we rush to talk about the outcomes of policy or the policies that are being developed, but understanding how policies develop and how they evolve is very, very important. And then I picked three areas of information policy that I thought are very timely and very appropriate: net neutrality and net governance. Very, very topical today. Data policy and stewardship, something I've been working on for several years now with the National Science Board and other entities. And they're going to have impacts on academic institutions, federal institutions. Do we need to put it on? And so data policy and stewardship, which I've worked on for the last several years, and then privacy and censorship, which are actually of concern and increasing concern to me and obviously to many others. And then I thought I'd end with the story of a story about the survival of the spider and the web. So how do we go forward? So what I'd like to do is to begin by going over how a spider spins a web. And I've taken this from How Stuff Works, the How Stuff Works website, great website. And this article and the accompanying graphics are by Tom Harris. So every web begins with a single thread, which forms the basis of the rest of the structure. And to establish this bridge, the spider climbs to a suitable starting point, up a tree branch, for example, and releases a length of the thread into the wind. And with any luck, sort of like fishing, and with any luck, the free end of the thread will catch on to another branch. If the spider feels that the thread has caught on something, it cinches up the silk and attaches the thread to the starting point. It then walks across the thread, releasing a looser thread below the first one, and it attaches this thread on both ends and climbs to its center. The looser strand sags down forward, forming a sort of U shape or a V shape. The spider then lowers itself from the midpoint to form a Y shape, and this forms the core support structure of the web. The spider easily grips the thin threads with special serrated claws, a smooth hook, and a series of barbed hairs on the end of its legs. So it's made to do this, right? And as it walks along the initial structural threads, it lays more frame threads between the various anchor points. Then it starts laying out the radius threads from the center of the web to its frames. The spider doesn't coat the frame and radius threads with sticky material because it needs to walk across them to keep building the web. After it's built the radius threads, the spider lays more non-stick silk to form an auxiliary spiral extending from the center of the web to the outer edge of the web. And then it spirals in on the web, laying out its sticky thread and using the auxiliary spiral as a reference. The spider eats up the auxiliary spiral as it lays out the sticky spiral, resulting in a web with the non-sticky radius threads for getting around and a sticky spiral for catching bugs. So you can get around it if you know where the sticky ones are. The spider sits in the middle of the web, monitoring the radius threads for vibrations. If an insect gets caught in any part of the web, the spider will feel the motion through the radius threads and makes its way to the vibration source. In this way, the web extends the spider's sensory system over a much, much wider area. The spider might also leave the web to retreat to a separate nest while monitoring the web via a connected signal line. So very, very interesting. I mean, I don't know if you ever knew. Web spinning spiders have an innate ability to tell the difference between vibrations from insect prey and vibrations from other sources, such as a leaf falling onto the web. Many species can also distinguish characteristic vibrations of dangerous insects, such as wasps, from their preferred prey. When the orb web has deteriorated and is no longer useful, many spiders will destroy it, eating up all the threads so that it can recycle the raw silk material. Spiders may leave the heavy bridge thread so that they can rebuild the web at a later point. So that's how webs are made, in case you wondered. So I thought I'd start with that, and as you can see, the subtitles I've had on the right-hand side sort of relate my talk to the different parts. So let's talk a little bit about the policy development process. So this is sort of laying the basis. Well, the policy development is a very complex process. I mean, as I used to think, oh, you know, I've got all the answers, I know what we want to do, let's just develop the policy, let's go and do it. But it's a little bit more complex. I mean, it's quite a bit more complex than that, just like the spider spinning the web. I can remember university presidents who've said to me over time, we should have a policy that nobody should keep email for longer than, pick your time, okay? I've had people starting off at about 6 weeks and getting down to 1 week. And I said, well, you know, that's sort of an interesting policy, but, you know, is it achievable? How would you implement it? How would you police it? It's impossible, because even if you deleted all the emails from our servers, they're out there. You haven't deleted them. So you have to think about what it is you're really trying to do. And you have to involve the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, with an interest in the particular policy issue. I like policy issues to be data-driven. That's who I am. So I would say data-driven when possible, rather than purely based on emotion or political sway. And it's very, very important, I think, in developing policies to frame the issues. The issues, what are you trying to do? Who should be involved? How should they be involved? When should they be involved? How does this come about? So that you don't have something that's an open-ended process, but you've framed it in some way, and understand the boundaries of what it is you're attempting to achieve with policy development. So you have to do the prep work, and then you can develop potential solutions. I'll talk about this in specifics as I go through the examples. But the review has to include thinking through both intended and unintended consequences. And I think all too often we don't anticipate. Maybe people get very enthusiastic about policies, and there are unintended consequences often. And if you don't involve all the stakeholders, you won't think about the potential unintended consequences. I think we have to look at the cost of implementing policy and the cost of not implementing policy. What are you going to lose? And there may be real cost involved. We have a lot of policy that's implemented at certain levels. I would say certainly at the federal level, probably at the state level, probably at the institutional level, that are unfunded mandates and that cause problems. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. And then I think we have to say, how are we going to measure impact and success? How will we know if we've been successful with the policy that we want to implement, or the policy area we want to explore and implement? So it's not just enough to do it, but can we actually make it happen? What if we don't follow the policy? What does that mean, and what are the consequences, and how are we going to actually measure going forward? So those are sort of straightforward things. But I also think that you have to have a starting point, and I've sort of become very, in terms of framing the issues, I thought you also almost have to come back to principles. What are the principles? What is it that you feel is important as a body? And we did this, first principles, when we, at the National Science Board, we were developing the Digital Research Data Sharing and Management Policy, which some of you may have come across, which will have an impact on researchers wherever they are, from publicly funded research, federally funded research, excuse me. But we created a set of principles which are fairly straightforward and pretty simple and sound good, but in the end they helped us define it, you know, what it was we wanted to do. And they were sort of very broad statements of openness and transparency are critical to continued scientific and engineering progress and building public trust in the nation's research enterprise. So we had that. And then we had open data sharing is closely linked to open access publishing, so that we defined our data sharing separate from open access publishing, but related, but they may have two different places. We said the nation's science and engineering research enterprise consists of a broad array of stakeholders. So we acknowledge the stakeholders, all of which should participate in the development and adoption of policies and guidelines. Very important to say up front. Recognized that standards vary across fields, so there's variation. One size does not fit all most of the time. Policies and guidelines are needed for open data sharing, which in turn requires active data management. So we went from sharing now to active, proactive stewardship curation activities. And then rights and responsibilities of individual investigators should be recognized, and the rights and responsibilities of people about whom data have been gathered also have rights and should be acknowledged. So we came up with a statement of principles because we wanted to tie all of our policy decisions or our policy development decisions to the statement of principles. Do these still meet the basic core principles that we've established? And I've started to use a set of principles as I'm moving forward in any kind of planning like that, because it's actually a good exercise, whether you put principles or values, whatever you put down. It's worth beginning to state them, because then you can see if things start to move you against those policies and principles. So in this arena of information policy, certainly sharing, archiving information, there are other principles and values depending on what it is you're looking at. So we also have issues of access, validity, security, and trust. And trust being, I think, one of the most important issues for this millennium, maybe, I mean, certainly beyond the decade, so you know, going forward, trust is a huge issue. And the erosion of trust in institutions, in technologies, in other things is of concern. Now, as we start looking at these issues, there are a number of intellectual rights that people have, and Nick Moore, with Acumen, identified 5 different types of intellectual rights. And I thought this is interesting to bring to your attention. He said individuals and citizens have intellectual property rights, which is the right to profit from one's intellectual endeavors and the right to prevent others from doing so. And that should include all works relating to literary, artistic, scientific works, performances by performing artists, phonograms, broadcasts, etc., industrial designs, trademarks, etc. And those should be recognized. I think we all understand the issue of intellectual property rights. Maybe we don't, but there's a big area of intellectual property rights, particularly as the intellectual property policies and regulations we have were not necessarily written for the environment that's emerging. These policies and procedures tend to lag behind actual practice, and that's where the clash comes, when practice and policy don't blend. Individual citizens and organizations have rights to control the use of information about them, and the whole purpose of the privacy law is to respect the right of the individual to retain autonomy in their lives and dealings with government, their dealings with companies, to retain control of their personal information. And I think this is a concern, that we have also different kinds of policies and regulations and laws in different countries affecting these things. So as we become more global in our interactions, we begin again to see the conflicts begin to arise between one country and another. The third one is freedom of information, the right of access to information held by governments and corporate bodies. And I think that we all should see what's there about us. And I think Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, were some of the first to actually ensure that every citizen had the right to know what data were available on them from the government. Censorship, we have the right to be protected from obnoxious information. And censorship is a sort of an authoritarian control of speech and other forms of expression, and exercised often by governing bodies, but not necessarily only by governing bodies, by any, you know, I'm not talking about governments, it could be a corporate body, or it could be an academic institution, it could, hopefully not, but it could be any kind of organization to which you belong. And then the fifth type of intellectual right is the right to access information and advice services, library services, information services, discovery services, etc. And so we have these rights, and I think that they are worth, they're sort of principles that we might hopefully look to when thinking about information policy. So those are the rights that I'd like to see any internet policy development and any information policy development think about very, very carefully. Now, let's talk about some specific issues. This is 1 week, and this is only of a couple of newspapers that I read. I actually skim about 5 of them, but I only get certain ones in hard copy, and I thought I'd like to show them to you because they're all about net neutrality, network governance, and privacy, and censorship. And it's, I think, of growing concern. So it really relates to net neutrality and network governance, very, very important because it's the core underpinning of the web. So when we think about net governance, there have been proposals to move to a more global involvement, which generally we would say is a good thing. I mean, there are many, many more stakeholders in the web. But it raises issues of trust. And how do we deal with governments that censor and won't allow certain content made available to people, don't allow free access? Would you want them to be part of the governing body? And how far along that road would one want to go? I mean, we've been fortunate actually that we develop things here and in Western Europe, but as the rest of the world gets engaged, how are we going to deal with this? And how do you ensure that things stay open and free? How do you keep political interests from taking control? They seem to be taking control everywhere in many different environments. Is it possible to build a representative governance model that will be accepted by all? Probably not, but you could maybe get closer to one if you defined your principles. What would the principles be? That the governing body must be able to demonstrate its ability or willingness to do A, B, and C. And the trust needs to be built up. Are governments actually the ones who have most control, or international corporations? Who controls what? And who should control? And how do we move about in that environment? So this is a topic that not too many people outside our field and the technology field have really thought too much about, but I think it's an important issue. Now, net neutrality is another issue that's very much in the news with the FCC proposal right now, which it's not easy to say, well, it's just all internet traffic is treated equally, because the US government was looking at taking over the net for emergency, at times of emergency. I suppose if it was a critical enough emergency, we wouldn't really care, because if it was sort of a major attack or a nuclear explosion caused by whatever, you would want to get information. But at the same time, how far down the line does that go? What types of emergencies are emergencies that warrant a takeover? We know that at times of war and insurrection, the first thing people go for are the communication channels, right? They used to go to the TV, they used to go to the radio stations and the TV stations, and they used to censor the press and they used to close the press. That's where you go to control a population, because if you can control the information they get, you can give them some sense, have some level of control. Not complete, but some level. And so now the proposals forward are for creating this multi-tiered system. But my concerns over that is there always tends to be the poor relation in this mix. And for too long, the poor relation has been education and research. I mean, it has typically, even as we looked Candy at the growth of the online, it was always, well, industry and entertainment will have the money to make this happen, and we'll ride along behind it. But now we've all become dependent on the internet and our ability to access information. So should we have toll booths on certain parts of the internet and free access on others, and how much is reserved, how many lanes go which way, and how? It's a big, complicated question, not easy. And who's controlling the foundational structure? So this relates to that very, very basic element of what the network is. And if we don't have some sense of say in this, if we aren't concerned about policies at this level, then we can't be, then we've given up responsibility for any policies that lay on top of that. And I think this is something, these two areas are things that we need to think about very carefully. How many of you have ever contacted your senators or congressmen about an issue? Good, good, good. We're getting engaged because we have to. Professional associations do that from time to time. They often get together. But it's important that voices are heard, and not just by the lobbyists, the paid lobbyists. I mean, it's important that people hear. And a call doesn't cost that much, just a few minutes of your time, but it's important to record it. So that was my end message will be, please get engaged and encourage your friends and colleagues to get engaged as well. Neutrality and governance, the control issue is important, and I just want to read you this. It's this quotation, and you'll be surprised at where it comes from, and maybe you know it. But as every man goes through life, he fills in a number of forms for the record, each one containing a number of questions. There are thus hundreds of little threads radiating from every man, millions of threads in all, each one of us. If these threads were suddenly to become visible, the whole sky would look like a spider's web. And if they materialized as rubber bands, buses, trams, and even people would lose all the ability to move, and the wind would be unable to carry torn up newspapers or autumn leaves along the streets of the city. They are not visible, they are not material, but every man is constantly aware of their existence. Each man, permanently aware of his own invisible threads, naturally develops a respect for the people who manipulate the threads. Written in 1968 in Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is so relevant to, I think, where we're getting to with the web today. There are wonderful things that it enables. There are scary things that it enables. And how do we find the right balance going forward? And how, and you know, we rely on the web so much in all aspects of our lives now, not just professionally, but personally, socially, emotionally. And so if we don't understand how this works, things can get way out of hand. And it reminds me very much of Larry Lessig's book called The Code. He wrote that about software. He said if you don't understand how software works, you can't really truly take advantage of it. I mean, you're going to be bound. The moment you put something in software, you have tied it down in some way. You have restricted in some way. You have not only enabled some functions, but you've disabled other capabilities to be built. And so it's understanding structures and interconnections become important. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but in August, this new Russian internet law goes into effect, and it is sort of chilling. I mean, here we are talking about network governance. Here we are, Russians moving in with this law. All bloggers must register with their government if their blogs receive more than 3,000 hits. Registered bloggers treated like mass media and have to certify the factual accuracy of the information, but they don't have the same protections as journalists. The government has grounds to press charges against them, including defamation and inciting hatred. So this is the kind of thing we heard with underground movements in the late 30s in Germany and other places. The new law prohibits revealing information about citizens' homes or their personal family laws, but they say this is to eliminate anti-corruption reports that have revealed excessively embarrassing details about people garnering wealth. All email providers and social networks have to store information about users and their posts and their email on servers in Russia. If they don't do so, they'll be blocked from all Russian users. Email providers must maintain 6 months of data on every user in Russia. Now, we also have some similar things like that that sort of been moving along here in the United States. Phone calls, emails, email traffic. My daughter came to me the other day. Did you know that Google is capturing all the information on your emails? I'm going, yeah. Okay. Did I know that my the phone traffic is going to the NSA? Yeah. Do they have time and ability to look at it all? Increasingly they do. So there are things. So ultimately, we have to be careful. And then the Russian one goes on. And then they blamed the fact on the internet and the fact that the internet was, according to Putin, developed as a special CIA project. Actually, it was DARPA project first, and then evolved to become more open and put out more commercially. So the commodity internet was developed in other ways. But I think what we're doing is we're seeing people coming from other angles, from other perspectives. So we need to be careful in this global environment of what we do versus what others do. So I think that whole area, the basic structure of the web and its underpinnings are things that if we have to pick areas of policy to engage in and make our voices heard, that's it. Because that will, if we don't get that right, if we don't get the foundations right, we won't get anything else right further than that. And because, for interest of time, I can't do a very deep dive into any of these, but data policy, let me mention there. In data policy, now we're moving on to building those radials in the web. So at National Science Board and the National Science Foundation, we took a look and we made a decision a number of years ago as a board that we were going to put a stake in the ground on data policy. NIH had been working the open access publishing policy, and we thought that was well along the way, and there were lots more discussions there. Very few people at that time were really talking about data, and anyone who knows anything about data knows that data very, very complicated. We still to this day haven't really defined what it is we mean when we talk about data and data policies, data curation. There are many different kinds of data. You have the raw data, you have the processed data, you have textual data, you have derived data. By the way, you have specimens and samples and other things that are also data in the broader sense of the term. So we realized that the landscape was pretty broad, and this wasn't something that could be solved overnight. This is something that's going to have to be bitten off in little pieces, hence we went to principles first. We found a landscape of diversity, different curation practices, different discipline and specialization needs. That was probably the biggest concern we had, that different disciplines and within disciplines people had different norms and practices and needs, diverse working methods from researchers, and diverse data types. So there are some fields of science, we were looking at science obviously, where data are made public as soon as they're captured. There are other fields where researchers capture the data and keep it, and it takes them quite a long time to work with it and come up with their analyses. And then we have those people who are doing a longitudinal analyses who take even longer. So all of these require a different thought, and again it wasn't clear that one size would fit all. So what we did was we engaged stakeholders through a series of meetings and workshops. We brought them together in Washington. We had speakers representing different points of view. We had fairly extensive discussions. We put out calls for information that were going out at the time. Right about the time when the Office of Science and Technology Policy of the President was also starting to look at open access publishing, public access to peer-reviewed publications, and public access to data. But we were slightly ahead. We'd had the workshops, they'd participated in our workshops. We had to look at existing policies, and there did exist some policies. Certainly NIH had a data plan policy for all of its proposals. The data plan was not included in the review of those proposals. NSF had a statement about data plans, and then we decided to add the requirement that this would become part of the review. That then raised another question. Did we have enough people who are capable of evaluating the different data plans that were submitted? Because early days, they were a little weak. Some were strong, but a lot were weak. So fortunately, several institutions stepped up and put tutorials on the web, how to build a good data plan, what it should contain, how it would, so that people could learn what it would take to have a good data plan, and they improved over time. That was sort of going on in parallel. The practices and expectations for, if you're looking at science, which includes basically science and social science from an NSF perspective, many different fields, and so we tried to gather different inputs from different fields. Many different offshoot discussions went on, fed in, and we had to try and find common ground. And then we had to start proposing, what if we were to do this? What if we were to do that? And then circle back to review with stakeholders. So this is a time-consuming process, and it's a lengthy process, even for the beginning parts of it. And it's not unlike the standards development process, which is also complex and also takes time. You can't come up with standards overnight if you have to have multiple stakeholder groups participate in the development of the standard and then implement the standards and connect their products and services so that they can be connected to the standards. So it's the same kind of thing. So we looked at the set of principles. As I said, here were the different principles we had. We kept these in front of us all the way through. We put these out actually first as a set of principles, and then we had our discussion groups with the various stakeholders to say, are there other areas? So we began to flesh out definitions of these for different areas so that everybody understood and bought off on the principles before we actually got to policy. And then we had a set of themes that we thought were important, and these included the commitment of sharing, reproducibility of data, education, training, and workforce development, cyber infrastructure to be underpinnings for this, longevity and sustainability of data, ethical and legal implications for protected classes, protected data, and all of this were our themes that we were trying to build policy around. So this is beginning to frame the issues, okay? And we came up with our report, which is available from the National Science Board website, and subsequently OSTP put out its mandate that all the federal agencies will ensure that public access to peer-reviewed publications and data sets within a year of publication, I believe, is the time limit that they had. Still some questions as to what's meant by data in that statement. What we did at the National Science Board and National Science Foundation was we felt that with these variations in norms and practices in different fields, we should tie data to the publication of results, so that the data should be made available after the publication of the results. So every researcher had the opportunity to do whatever analysis they needed. That was the way to get everyone to agree. There'd be different time frames for different disciplines. But we also said, as a starting point, that people should make a sufficient amount of data available so that people could understand where the results came from. Okay, so it didn't have to be every data set you've produced, everything you had. It had to be enough. And in some instances, that might be as simple as a table. In some instances, it might be a more complex set. But we felt that if we started with the very basics, we could begin to move forward. We could attune the different stakeholder groups to the need and the importance of making data available as part of the responsibility of researchers using public funds for their research. So that's sort of where we came. So it's now moving out. Academic institutions, I'm sure including yours, are looking at how this gets implemented since it's an unfunded mandate. We did do some analyses of what it would cost, and I think we determined that it would cost, and in the publications arena, I think it's, to put out open access publications is about 2% of the R&D loading, and to put out data, depending on how much you put out, was between 6 and 16% of the total. So it could be very expensive. So institutions are now struggling with how to deal with this, and the federal agencies are now figuring out how they're going to manage this process. Are they going to have their own repositories? Are they going to build on each other's repositories? The publishers have stepped up with Chorus and their opportunity. Share exists with AAU and other institutions, AAUP, looking at what else can be done. So there are various solutions beginning to be put forward. And I think, quite frankly, one solution won't work, because then it would appear to be too much top-down control. So I anticipate we'll see different models emerge going forward. But the idea was, at least let's start, so that people, if we don't start now, I mean, look how long open access publishing has been talked about and experimented with. And data is much more complicated, so if we don't start, we won't ever get there. So privacy and censorship, these are the sticky threads. This is the beginning of the sticky threads, I think. Personal privacy versus public good. Personal customization versus public accessibility, and intentional greed versus unintentional carelessness. You can pick many others, but I just picked 3 to give us something to think about. Most internet users, and this was in 2000, want privacy tilted away from them, and I can tell you this latest issue here where we see all these cookies hang up the cookies, cut the threads. This is on Give Me Back My Privacy. This was a special feature on big data. But privacy was a key in there. Ironically, I thought it was interesting how consumers are using big data for their own purposes was on the back page of it. So, you know, there were both sides of it perfectly listed for me. So they are concerned. 54% of internet users believe that web tracking is harmful because it invades their privacy. It's a concern. And to some extent, we almost take it for granted. We see, you know, the pop-ups, we see what comes up when we're doing searches, and, you know, it's there. I tell you the thing that gets me most, it's target. And it's that thing, you can put in any search term you want, and it says, come to target for X, whatever your search term is, and it's just frustrating to see it every time. Okay, even if you put National Science Board in, it'll come target, National Science Board. And you can buy all these things. So The public's right to access public records and the individual's right to dignity and privacy are both recognized to be principles of the utmost importance in a free society. So we have to facilitate our public access to public records, and we have to protect from disclosure about particular individuals. I mean, there's something on the news this morning about public records, mugshots, I think it was. People's mugshots are being sold, and there are websites that have mugshots of people that may never have been convicted of anything, and then they're charged a fairly exorbitant amount to have that mugshot taken down. And when they have it taken down, then they find out it was sold to yet another site. So it's one of those things that we're seeing more and more of these kinds of things. Well, what's the public good? Well, we may need to know the activities of individuals who may become terrorists or criminals. Governments need to know how much people earn so that they can gain taxes. Census data, important to plan public services. Lots of good reasons. But we need to balance these out, their conflicts. I mean, how do you figure out who's a terrorist? If I look at certain websites, am I going to be labeled a terrorist? If I earn so much, then maybe somebody might come to my house, which, by the way, is on the web because there was a web tour of it when I bought it, and it's up there somewhere with the value of the house and everything else. And by the way, if I start using these remote accesses, I get very nervous about using remote accesses because I figure somebody will simply hack into my target, hack into my device. And then if I'm a minority or if I've responded in some way to the census data, maybe I'll be barred for certain services. We have to think about those things. More people have more access to information. There are more individuals raising concerns. There's moral censorship, military censorship, political censorship, religious censorship, corporate censorship, many, many other types. Who decides what's offensive? Who decides what is? Have any of you tried and changed your search habits as a result of this? I had to do a search one time. I had to put into the same, not the same search, but certain messages and certain emails and certain searches, the words Laura Bush and Ayatollah a number of years ago. And I thought, I think I might get a call. It was a perfectly legitimate reason. We were having a celebration. We were honoring Laura Bush and an Ayatollah, who was not the Ayatollahs that we might not want to give an award to. And they were both in there in the same document. I was concerned that at some point somebody would come knocking on the door. Personal customization. Well, social professional networking sites like Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, we want to have them more personalized. We want e-commerce sites to sort of know what we like so that we don't have to deal with the mass of different things. Search engines give us top-line recommendations based on search plus recent searches. Email, Gmail with ads to the sides based on, don't you get email ads for all these academic works that are, academic courses that are being offered by your competitors, for example? They always seem to pop up. Even if I'm not looking at those sites, they pop up because of my affiliation. So public accessibility, I mean, it's important to see city and neighborhood and institutional crime rates. Environmental information, finding out about, I live near 2 toxic cleanup sites. Want to make sure everything's okay. Water quality, other things. Online sexual offender registries now have maps, and they're very, very specific. Now you get the alert, somebody's moved into your area. Average wage by geographic area can be very helpful to know. Infectious disease outbreaks by geographic area may be very good to know, but also might have the other side, may stop people coming into your area, may stop people investing in your area, etc. So how do I keep my 13-year-old daughter safe from a criminal who's using her posted information? That's one we can all be concerned about. Could somebody misconstrue my combined interest of Laura Bush and Ayatollah? And what if I'm trying to sell my home and I live near a toxic waste site that's been cleaned up? Will they follow through sufficiently? So these have both sides. Intentional greed versus unintentional consequences. Well, we all know about identity theft. It's becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Huge amounts of theft, large numbers of people involved, takes a long time. They say, here's the average amount of time it spends to regain your identity, and in total it can take up to this many hours, in other words, several years before you get it back, and you may not ever get back to where you were. So real troubling stuff here that's in intentional greed. Here's the crooks versus the corporations, and the crooks are winning. And How many of you got caught up in one of the credit card, the store card things? Yep, me too. All my prescriptions went off, and now I have to get them back on, you know, getting them on automatic and so on. So massive consumer data breach cost a lot of money. In fact, it cost the CEO his career this last week. He'd been there for many, many years. But nearly 2/3 of data breaches were due to negligence, mistakes, and system errors. So it's not all criminality. There are other things we have to look at. How many of you encrypt your email? Good for you, good. Not many. There aren't many. I mean, you know, we've just put out a series of security videos required for all our personnel. And it really talks about the importance of encryption. So I asked the question, well, what are we doing about encryption? Well, not much. So it is of concern, and I think we need to be mindful. Especially those of us who've been working with the web since it was the web, or before it was the web. I mean, we take it for granted sometimes that, you know, people are going to do. So let me talk a little bit about the survival of the spider in the web, and I'm going to tell you a story, and hopefully this will give you an idea of where I think we need to go. It's important, I think, that we take a step back in any environment. In this case, we're talking about the web environment, the different information policy arenas within it, and there's more than one. And we need to look at these things from a perspective that's broader than ourselves, okay? So about 6 hours south of New Delhi, oops, I'm sorry. Let me just go. The ecosystem. It is about the ecosystem. Yes, we need to have a balanced ecosystem, and because there are many of us and many different players and interrelating in different ways. So in their own ecosystem, in the web, spiders are the wolves, lions, and tigers. The information ecosystem, our web will survive or die based on how well we build that web, based on some of these areas and some others. So how are we going to get there to the right decisions? Okay. Helen Keller, famous quote from her, alone we can do little, together we can do much. And that's the ultimate message. And we have to engage all stakeholders. We have to agree on what we want to try and do. We have to ensure that each participant gets something out of it, gets something positive out of it. We have to commit to meeting and protecting the ecosystem that we're talking about, and meeting people's top-line values and needs. And for each participant, find a way that will contribute to both of those, the success of the whole and the success of the individual groups. Okay, so now we get to the story. About 6 hours south of New Delhi in India is the Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan. The park serves as the habitat for a rare tiger population. Many people come to visit India generally, and this national forest in particular, to see and study tigers. And in so doing, they bring money into the country and to the villages around the park. The tiger is also the national animal of India, and they figure prominently in Indian folklore, art, and traditions. The tiger has lost 92% of its habitat, and its population has shrunk from 100,000 to about 3,000, all in the last 100 years. And there's significant concern, especially in India, that these magnificent animals will soon be extinct in the wild. However, numerous problems were threatening the particular ecosystem supporting the tigers. First of all, local farmers were going into the jungle to cut down trees for firewood. As the villagers cut down trees, the forest receded. This not only reduced the size of the tiger's habitat, it also eliminated much of their food supply, such as monkeys, who no longer had the trees in which they lived, so they'd left the area. The cleared areas now gave farmers easier access to the jungle, so they'd send their cows in to graze on the edges of the jungle. Hungry tigers found themselves in the proximity of the cows, and tigers being tigers and cows being cows, the tigers, of course, killed and ate them. Other villagers needed money to send their children to school. Though it was illegal to hunt the tigers, one tiger pelt could pay for a year's schooling for a whole family of children. So poaching was increasing, further decreasing the tiger population. The farmers were angry that the tigers were eating their cows, so when the poachers headed into the jungle, the farmers looked the other way. Go ahead, get rid of those nasty tigers. The national park steward, trying best to steward this important national treasure, the tigers put up enormous fence between the villages and the park. But the villagers and poachers simply climbed them or broke them down. The park rangers, the government, the villagers, and the poachers were in a constant state of conflict and distrust. More and more tigers were being killed. The steward's son eventually inherited oversight of the park, and he decided there needed to be a radically different approach if the tiger ecosystem were to be saved. The new steward tore down the fence and sold all the materials. He reassigned most of the park patrol rangers to new projects, and he instituted a new tax for tourists coming into the area. Once he had funds, the first thing he did was set up a medical clinic for the villagers and the poachers to improve the health of the community generally, and to get to know the people, and to build up trust and goodwill between the park staff and the area people. Then he worked with the villagers to breed cows that gave more milk with less feed, decreasing the need for extensive grazing land. And then he suggested to the farmers that instead of cutting down trees for fuel, they collect cow manure and use biogas units to transform it into fertilizer and fuel. Farmers could keep the cows closer to home, fertilize their land so it would grow better feed, not have to venture into a jungle full of ferocious tigers, and stop cutting down and dragging trees back into the village. Then he planted new trees and assigned each tree to a villager. If they could keep their assigned trees alive, he paid them, and he paid them more each year they kept the tree alive. Thus the steward offered the poachers free schooling for their children if they stopped poaching, and he gave them camels to create income from milk and to use for transportation for themselves and for the tourists. Over the course of a few years, the area's ecosystem was transformed. The farmers stopped cutting down trees and instead were contributing to reforesting the jungle. The cows stayed in the village, out of the way of the tigers. The poachers had their children in school and a new livelihood, and the tiger population started increasing again, increasing tourism and general foreign investment in the area. So it really is something that sometimes we have to stop looking at everything from our own perspective, take a step back, look down at the whole system, understand the interdependencies and the interrelationships, and try and create positive forces through the ecosystem rather than destructive forces through the ecosystem. And just to summarize that, three quotations. The first one is this Swahili proverb, which is really mirroring Helen Keller's comment: a boat doesn't go forward if each one's rowing its own way. We need to agree on where we want to be, and we need to get all the people working in the same direction. Number two, it's going to take time. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others, and it would be better in some instances to go far. And we want to commit a collaborative effort to optimize on the ecosystem rather than each element be optimized in and of itself, and the whole doesn't optimize. And then finally, I think a very, very important quote: conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen in these environments. We can't give away. But combat is optional. So rather than being combative, we need to find ways to get others to think about this in a broader perspective. And that's what I'm going to say. No, there were two things. The Science Board is the governing body and the policy setting body for the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation is a major player in academic research, as is NIH. NIH was a participant, as was Energy, as was NASA, etc. So the Science Board said, first of all, let us take, and they're also an advisory body to the President and the Congress. So when the Science Board takes on a project, it has some attention paid to it. We opted not to become one of a long string of players in the open access publishing, although we were interested in following along, not to say that. But nobody was taking a stand and starting to really take a serious look at data. And so we felt that that would be an area where our attention would be more appropriate. Meanwhile, we took a look at the policy that already existed at NSF, and it was an unenforced policy. It had a statement about data plans, but it wasn't being enforced. So the first thing we did was reinforce that. If we're going to have the policy, let's reinforce it. Then we discovered we needed people who could evaluate the data plans, so that was put in place. So that was going along. While we were talking about data policies, a lot of people got interested in data policies. A lot of professional associations, scientific societies got very excited about this. The Europeans got very interested. They'd been talking about it for a while. So other groups, nationally and internationally, started to pay attention and engage. The Congress had set up a roundtable to look at these, predominantly at open access publishing. That roundtable came in with a report. The White House, through its Office of Science and Technology Policy, was very interested in openness in terms of, and sort of building trust in public-funded research. And so they became very interested, and they were supportive of our moving in this direction. So we took the first lead in this area, got others engaged, and then we actually had policies ready to go for NSF. They were held up while the White House pulled things together at a higher level across all federal agencies, feeling that going ahead with one agency was probably not the best way to go, but rather have all agencies move a little bit more consistently at the same time. And so they put forth their requirement, and the requirement for implementation, the implementation date is coming up, so that federal agencies had to decide how they were actually going to administer this environment. At the same time, research officers at research universities have been engaged in a lot of discussion about this, understanding the principles and trying to figure out how this is going to happen. The same thing happened with the open access publishing mandate of NIH. And I don't know if you remember, but our medical librarians were very active in helping educate researchers, in helping ensure that the documents would in fact be migrated to some kind of public access repository at the right time. Several institutions, some in this area, set up funds to help the author payment schemes that operate in some of the open access arenas. Meanwhile, things moved ahead in Europe, so there are mandates in Europe for gold open access, and again, a somewhat funded mandate. I won't say it's unfunded, but according to the institutions I've spoken to, not funded enough. So there are interesting questions there. So these things are not free. None of these things are free. They cost money. And, you know, you can't always think about the major players. There are a lot of minor players. I mean, 4,000 academic institutions in this country. Not all of them are R1 classification universities. And so, you know, while major players with research overhead funds that perhaps they can direct to some of these activities, the vast majority of universities have faculty who are actively engaged in research and scholarship and publishing who don't have funds to move in this direction. And the dilemma is, if we end up with multiple systems, tiered systems, you're going to get a first class and a second class environment, and that will tend to drive resources in particular directions. So I think we have to be careful not to create an environment that chops up the environments that we have into separate parts, where you have first-class universities and second-class universities and third-class universities. That's not what we want. That would go against everything we want to try and do in the notion of openness and access to information. The important thing is, it's become increasingly of concern with some of the publishing that has occurred, where we've had fraudulent articles, misrepresentation of results, unsubstantiated claims in results, and sometimes, and if you don't have any access to what went into those conclusions or those findings, how can anyone ever validate, replicate, reproduce, etc. So those are the kinds of concerns we had in the scientific environment of wanting. So it wasn't that we said, let's do this, and suddenly it became bigger, because it's a very big topic. And then it became the big data topic. And my concern is, while we can all be focused on big data, there are lots of small and medium datas in there that also need to be paid attention to. So the movement towards registering data sets, organizing them, creating appropriate metadata, that people will be able to do something with the data. The big question of algorithms, software, etc., versions has not yet been addressed. That will come later, but just some basics. We want some small baby steps. I think this will be years in development. Years. Right. I do think the biggest issue for this day and age is trust. I think all kinds of trust are eroding. And how do we go back to begin to build trust between stakeholder groups? It's got to happen at some point. And then you have to have, what's the net? What's the safety net that you put in place? Usually government played the safety net role. But as governments become you know, more political, more short-term oriented, less customer-driven, corporations become you know, perhaps more profit-driven, etc. It just becomes almost a different world. And it's the same thing I feel almost with privacy. I mean, I used to feel, okay, I can maneuver in this environment, I know something about how it works, I can figure out what's good and what's not good and avoid the pitfalls, but I don't know anymore. Sometimes I feel as though I am the fly in that web, and it's all around me, and I'll never be able to get beyond it. So I think the governance issue is an important one, and each one of these areas you could create. I gave a talk last week on some of this. You can create a sliding scale, right? And how far along can you slide the meter or the switch, and how much can you afford. It's going to go back and forth because the waves of change are such that it'll go back and forth, but how far can it afford to go back and forth in the pendulum swinging before you've lost the characteristics of what it is you're trying to achieve? And it's a very, very complex question. And as I say, I don't have all the answers, but they've done it in the standards arena fairly well. And it takes a lot of time and attention to detail. And persistence, perseverance are the things that reign there. And it's not going to change overnight. But I do think that ACES as an organization, other information organizations, academics as individuals and as organizations should have a louder voice, because unfortunately the big money lobbyists tend to be the ones that get the attention of everyone. So if you're ever in Washington on a Thursday afternoon, they all go home on a Thursday afternoon, it might well be on your flights. You can look around. I saw several last Thursday. I wasn't doing it deliberately, but I saw several, including one of my own congressmen, in the airport lounge waiting for their flights. So Thursday afternoon, it's a good time to catch them in Washington. Well, it's hot. Well, in personal lives, we see people now building groups of people who go off grid, right, for deliberate reasons, and they're getting ready for some point at which they say, I'm going off. I do think we've become so dependent. It's hard to imagine a lot of areas of our lives functioning if we don't have some level of interconnectivity. We already know in a number of arenas internationally, we're beginning to come against agreements and pacts that, the Europeans with the US, for example, have different ideas about when things will be published, for example. There are some of those things have come up. So I think what we have to do is to define where we can exert some level of influence at the most important things. That's why it's important, I think, to get your principles down, because you can lose the frills. What you have to do is go back to the core. And I think for organizations, we have to go back to the cause, right? What is your core mission? So stop trying to do it all. At least protect core mission. For individuals, I think we have to protect our own version of our own desired way of life. And how do we do that and be mindful of the tendencies? I mean, we can't walk down the street. You're going to be photographed somewhere, somehow. London's been like that for a long time. Now it's coming here to big stadiums and other gathering places, but stores, every store has one. People taking photos in the street, you're in the background. Somebody at some point could capture that and get you. And I had a friend who worked on the facial recognition software many, many years ago. It's there. The drones. I mean, we think about big drones that go to Afghanistan, but what about drones when they become the size of a fly? Will we know the difference? They'd probably be pretty good by then. So the fly on the wall becomes a real thing, And I just see things going along. I mean, maybe we all have to look at science fiction. I mean, H.G. Wells was a good predictor of a number of things. Some of the science fiction writers have really projected some of these, but I'm hoping it won't happen quite that quickly, although I suspect it will happen faster than I would like. And for young people, this is going to be your world. You have to figure this one out. But I've got to the point where, having been a great proponent of this technology, I am a little nervous about where it's going. And will it be so big that we can't control it? It'll just roll on under its own momentum. I know we've democratized, we've got lots of people doing lots of things, but in doing so, we've also developed a lot of noise, too much. How do we deal with it? And so we see pieces of the web, each of us, and I'm not sure we know anymore the totality of what's happening and how it's being used or misused. So, the other side of is privacy censorship, and I'm not sure privacy exists in the way we used to understand it. I also think young people have different views on these kinds of things. I mean, it used to be, we used to read manuals for every application. That's the way we used to do it. Read the manual, learn about it, try it out. We don't do that anymore. The next generation came along, it's sort of a trial and error. Let me see how it works. I can figure this one out. I still say today to young people, how do you know that? How do you know when a new feature comes along? Somebody has to tell you. So it's changing already, but it's not just changing here, it's changing everywhere in different parts of the world. And there are criminal organizations very well established. We used to say, I did some work with the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the drug cartels had a lot more money than the government had, and were always able to catch up technologically and avoid various traps. Not all of them, but they avoided a number of them. And that's what's happening in the electronic world with all of these different kinds of hacking, different kinds of scams, different kinds of schemes. Not just for gain. You know, the criminal element is out there as fast as it can. They're very, very creative, and we don't know where they are or who they are. So that's the dark side of the whole thing. So everything that's good has the potential for being misused. It's concerning, I have to say. And maybe it's just because I'm getting old. I think they're trying to get people started without being so prescriptive that people just would say, oh, I'm not going to do that. So to try and move people along. And they themselves are learning as they go along. Right? This is something we haven't required, and it's something that is of concern. Now, it's not of concern in every case. Of large-scale projects with lots of large data, multiple institutions, you want to have one level of look. Individual researchers, small data sets, less of an issue. You can always opt out. There's an opt-out clause. You just say, we're going to opt out for this reason. But I think over time, they want to get people to become more aware of the capabilities. The other thing is, I believe the federal agencies are still talking about their solutions for registries, and I understand that they have some meetings coming up to make a decision. And there are different solutions, no one size fits all, but at least it isn't every agency doing something different, which would create more chaos. So there are some institutions going in one direction and some in another, but it hasn't been announced yet. Yeah, very important, both of them. Clearly, the role of educators and teachers is very important, and people need to understand data, and they need to understand how data lead to results. So people need to learn a little bit more about how to turn data and develop conclusions from data. And the researchers know it because they go through the training, but most of the public don't. So we do see, even among policymakers, at the higher levels, state and federal, we see them making conclusions that also aren't necessarily substantiated by their research, their fairly superficial level of research, or even fairly deep research, but they don't understand the area. So that's of concern. And so I do think there's a role for the journalists and the technical writers, if you like, to educate people as to whether results are valid or can be proven or validated, and to what extent, or whether there's a certain amount of ambiguity in the results. I mean, I know for a fact that I've looked at whole bodies of work that have been funded by certain agencies or foundations, and if you look at each of the projects, I mean, they look good in and of themselves. When you delve down, even those conclusions weren't all borne out by the data that existed. Then those findings got published, and then those findings got taken by others. So there is a lot of misrepresentation of the strength and quality of research outputs in some way, and that's just me being critical, but I've looked at it. I think it's important that those people involved in analyzing the quality of the product that we're delivering to our user communities understand that process as well. Where does it come from? How was it vetted? How, etc. It used to be, you may remember, that the editing of journal articles was much deeper than it is today, in part because more articles are being published, they're more complex, etc. And it's expensive to put that much time into editing deep. So there's a greater reliance on the authors. Institutions have a role, and they haven't played the role very much. But you know, we ought to all play a little bit more of a role. But educators are very, very important in the mix. I think we need to make students at the undergraduate level not only more information fluent, I like fluency, I prefer it to literacy, to more information fluent, but also more data fluent. Because you can't avoid interacting with data of some form or another. And data, I interpret it broadly. I don't mean structured numbers, I mean everything that's sort of evidence that's brought to bear. And increasingly, we need to allow our students to maneuver in a world understanding all the evidence that's available to them, understanding the quality of the evidence that's presented, understanding the range of tools and methods that exist for analyzing, and understanding the implications of results. Okay, so that's a much, much broader data awareness, data fluency, information awareness, information fluency than we currently have in curricula. But that's where I'd like to see it go. No, you have to be careful that you don't take on the wrong ecosystem. I mean, you can't make it be so big that you'll never actually get to anything. So if you don't find some level of common ground, at least in agreeing as to what the principles are, then you've got to sort of change the ecosystem that you look to get people who do understand. And remember, you can make progress in one area, others may come to the table later. So if you build coalitions, and I'm also not naive. It's not that we're suddenly all going to be holding hands and singing. It just doesn't happen this way, because even if we got that far, somebody else would come along and disturb the system just because they could. So it's a constant thing. But I do think that everybody wants to survive as a species. So every group, identified by role or function, wants to survive as a species, right? Whoever they are. And what we've got to find then are ways that we can all survive, but we may survive a little bit differently from the way we thought. And the tendency is to protect what we have, to dig in our heels, and to push out any thought of doing anything differently, because we become overly defensive. And then you've got everybody who's overly defensive, and then you can't go anywhere. So who do you pick? That's another question. Who do you pick to come to the table? People who can think a little bit more broadly, people who can think a little bit more further ahead, people who can influence others. These are the kinds of people you've got to work with, and it takes time. This doesn't happen overnight either. It takes time. We had to work with the different groups that have an interest. I mean, gosh, we were out talking with them, we were going to the meetings, we were trying to bring some of them to the table, we had open calls, then we had others say, we weren't invited to that. Well, we had an open call, we'd come on in anyway, come and talk to us. I mean, it was constant. I mean, the amount of interaction that was generated just on this area, which is why, if we'd taken on open access publishing too, we'd have been in the depths. So you want to take on a piece, and this same thing within an institution. If you want to create policy, you've got to get your various groups around the table. So I do believe, I'm positive enough that I think you can find groups, but you may not find the group you thought you were going to find. Okay, that's where I am. And then there can be the disruptors. So sometimes the disruptors can help you too.